Today's reading is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and it can be found on page 1266. I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weakness. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from him, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super-apostles, even though I am nothing. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. How are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. Now I am ready to visit you for the 3rd time, and I will not be a burden to you, because what I want is not your possessions, but you. After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. So I will very gladly spend for you everything I have, and expend myself as well. If I love you more, will you love me less? Be that as it may, I have not been a burden to you, yet, crafty fellow that I am, I caught you by trickery. Did I exploit you through any of the men I sent to you? I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not walk in the same footsteps by the same Spirit? Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? We have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ, and everything we do, dear friends, is for your strengthening. For I am afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. I fear that there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. I am afraid that when I come against my God, will humble me before you. That when I come again, my God will humble me before you, and I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged.
Well, I wonder what you're struggling with at the moment. Maybe you're struggling to pay bills. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment. Maybe you're struggling with some health issues. Could be something short-term. Could be actually a long-term health issue. Maybe you hate your job. Maybe you struggle with loneliness or sadness. Maybe you have relationship worries. Maybe you've got family worries. Maybe you're struggling with things to do with mental health. We hear a lot more about that these days, don't we? I could go on. I could go on with a list, couldn't I? In fact, I would be amazed if it wasn't the case that most of us could identify with one or more of those things that I've just mentioned. And there might be other things that you're struggling with at the moment. Now, the good news is you've come to the right place this morning, and we've come to the right place in 2 Corinthians 12. Paul, if you've been with us other weeks, but if you haven't, here's a little recap. Paul has been laying out just recently in the last couple of chapters some of the hardships he's endured as he challenges these people called the super apostles, these other people who've come into the church in Corinth. And Paul has been sort of laying out his own credentials. He's found it a very uncomfortable process, and we saw that a bit more this morning. But there's also, it's not just about Paul though, it's also about us. And we're going to see this morning some of his struggle, and I think that will help us in our struggles. So whether you're always here on a Sunday morning or you're quite new to church, you're just looking into Christian things, I hope you'll find this somewhat helpful this morning. Now, although we had the full chapter 12 read, I'm really going to be focusing on the first 10 verses this morning. And then next week, as we look at chapter 13, we'll also pick up the second half of chapter 12. I've got 3 things I particularly want us to notice this morning. If you're a regular, you think, that's no surprise, Peter, that you are 3 things. But here's what we're going to see. We're going to see how God honoured Paul, how God humbled Paul, and how God helped Paul. So that's all about Paul. But I think we're going to be able to see some helpful things that will apply to us as well. So the first of those, how God honoured Paul. Now, I don't know if you picked this up as it was read, but you can maybe, as you hear chapter 12 read, or as you read it yourself, you pick up a sense of awkwardness in Paul as he continues to be conflicted. Have a look at the first verse. So if you're using one of the church Bibles, it was page 1266, second column, about a quarter of the way down. He says, I must go on boasting, although there's nothing to be gained. So he's been all the way through the last couple of chapters, he's been conflicted about this, like, I've got to sort of give you my credentials, but I feel awkward about it, just like we might feel awkward filling in a job application or in a job interview. You sort of got to sell yourself, and that feels uncomfortable to many of us. Paul feels a little bit like that, and you get a sense of that awkwardness in what he's saying. He keeps describing it as foolishness, what he's saying. Paul has had a great honour of being particularly and in a peculiar way spoken to by God. Now, he talks a little bit about that here, but actually, if we know the story of Paul, and we get a lot of that in the book that's called the Acts of the Apostles, although it's mainly about 2 apostles, it's about Peter in the first half and Paul in the second half, we get a lot about how God has particularly spoken to Paul. We're not going to turn up all these sections, but let me just give you a flavour of that. God speaks in an unusual way. The Lord Jesus speaks to Paul in an unusual way at his conversion. You can read about that in Acts 9, verse 3. And then he sort of gives a second version of it in Acts 22, verse 6, when he's thinking back to it. He's talking about it much later. So God speaks to him directly in a way that doesn't happen for almost anyone. And then Acts 9 verse 12 tells us that God speaks to him again, telling him about this guy Ananias who's going to meet him at Damascus and help him. In Acts 22 verse 17 he talks about how he had a vision where God was telling him about his special job he was going to have to take the gospel to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, and that is then what he spent the rest of his life doing. During doing that, Acts 16 verse 9 tells us that he had a vision of being told to go to Macedonia. He was in what we would call Turkey, to go over to what we would call Greece, called Macedonia then, to take the gospel there, and then he arrives in places like Philippi, and we read about what he got up to there. But that was a vision of this Macedonian man calling him to go over there. In Acts 18, verse 9 and 10, we hear that having had a hard time in Corinth, God encouraged Paul in a vision. There's another one. And then after he was arrested in Jerusalem, later on, you read about this in Acts 23, verse 11, God encouraged him again in a vision. Later in the story, Acts 27, Acts chapter 27, verse 23, he's been transported to Rome to stand trial, and he's in this massive storm and shipwreck. And God speaks to him there and tells him that nobody on the ship will drown. Amazing that. It's running aground, it's getting smashed up, and they all make it to the shore safely. But Paul was told that by God directly. Alongside that, God gave Paul some profound insight into his plans, God's plans. And he talks about that in Ephesians 3, verses 1 to 6. That he's had that sort of special revelation from God. So that's quite a catalogue of things, isn't it? Quite a list of things. Even for somebody in the Bible, that's an unusually large amount. Even for a Bible character, what a blessing, what an honour. God has honoured Paul. He's treated him in an extraordinary way. And then there's this incident that he talks about in 2 Corinthians 12. Now, just to be clear, he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, etc., etc. He's talking about himself, but he's sort of talking about himself in the third person. The context makes it clear it's really him he's talking about, but he's sort of not wanting to show off. But it's also not just an idea that Paul's come up with. Apparently rabbis in those times, it was a common sort of teaching method to talk about yourself, but in the third person. But he talks about this experience that he's had. He goes to heaven, what he describes as the third heaven, in a way that he doesn't really understand. It's clear he doesn't understand. Twice he says, I don't know if it was I there bodily, was I just, some sort of spiritual way taken there. What does he mean by the third heaven? Well, that was a common way then of talking about heavens. We understand it slightly differently, don't we, because of modern science, but they would think of the first heaven being, what you can see where the birds fly and clouds are. That's the first heaven. There's a second heaven, which is where the stars and the sun and moon are, we would call space. A third heaven is, well, beyond that, it's where God lives. So that was just 3 sort of levels that they would think about. And you can see how that idea would get there. But he's saying, I'm not just saying I was like flying, looking down at trees or something. I wasn't in outer space. I was where God is. That's what he's saying. He doesn't really understand fully what that is, but he does know that there were things there that he heard or were told, things not to be repeated. It's an interesting contrast, this great honour. He's been lifted up to heaven, so to speak. At the end of the last chapter, chapter 11, we saw this at the very end of our reading last week. He's been lowered down a basket down the wall of Damascus. Here he's been lifted up by God to heaven. There he's been lowered down, sort of a humiliating escape from capture in being lowered into a laundry basket or something off the wall. But here he has been lifted up by God. But amazingly, he's kept it to himself for 14 years. He doesn't seem to have been talking to people about this. He's kept it to himself. I wonder if we would do that. I'll just let you into a little secret. While Peter Wolford was praying earlier, I actually heard the prayer arriving in God's inbox while he was praying. It was this ding as it arrived. You probably didn't hear it, but I, being super spiritual, and down here near the front row, I actually heard it the prayer arriving in God's inbox. It was amazing. No, I'm joking. I don't know what that was. Something on the computer, wasn't it? But some weird noise that happened in the prayer. You kept going, Peter. Well done. Just persevering. And it was an odd thing. But if something super spiritual happened to us, I think we would struggle to keep it to ourselves. I think we'd be telling people. He doesn't seem to have told people for 14 years until he's sort of backed into a corner to have to talk about it now. Why? He actually tells us why that's the case at the end of verse 6. He says, I've refrained, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do and say. He said, I wanted, as I came bringing this message about Jesus to you, I wanted to be judged not on claims of some divine experience, therefore you must listen to me, but actually on his message that he brought, on the lifestyle that backed that up. He says, however, it is true that this happened, but that isn't what he's been telling them as to why they should listen. He's wanted the gospel of Jesus Christ to stand on its own 2 feet, so to speak. Now, we probably haven't had that experience of going to heaven and hearing amazing things, have we? Although who knows, because maybe there's someone here who, like Paul, has been keeping a secret for 14 years. I don't know. But we probably haven't had that experience, have we? But I wonder if we would be able to say, as Paul does at the end of verse 6, I want people to judge me on how I am with them, what I say, what my behaviour is. It's quite a challenge to think about how we get on if that is how people are observing our lives and thinking about us. Now, we may say, all this has happened to Paul. Paul's been honoured by God in all these ways. It's amazing he's been able to, his head hasn't swelled to the size of a, huge watermelon or something. It's amazing that he's not got big-headed. How has he stayed so humble? Well, actually, he tells us, and that's my second thing. So how God has humbled Paul. He tells us that in verses 7 and 8. He has suffered. He has suffered. And it has kept his feet on the ground. Now, there's various reasons that people suffer. Suffering is simply part of being human. Our bodies grow old. Our teeth drop out. I've been particularly aware of that lately. Our bodies are a strange mix of something that's really useful and helpful and gives us lots of enjoyable things that we can do with our bodies, climbing mountains and going to Morrison's and all sorts of enjoyable experiences we can have. Maybe going to Morrison's isn't that enjoyable for you, but if you go to the bakery department and just inhale, it's amazing, it's lovely. Anyway, but there's all sorts of great things that come with having a body, but having a body also means you would get aches and pains. Things go wrong. We hurt it. Bits don't work properly. There's no avoiding it, is there? And then it's a bit like that with human relationships and with family. There's so much joy and so much love and so much happiness that can come from human relationships and family, but also so much pain. There's so many hard things that can come from that as well. It's part of being human to face suffering. So that's one reason we have suffering. But two, suffering sometimes comes because of foolish behaviour. We can bring it upon ourselves. Disobedience to God and his ways. He's told us how to live in his word. We ignore it, we think we know better. and so often it gets us into big problems. God sometimes permits us to reap what we've sown. Sometimes he guards us from that, but sometimes he permits us to reap what we have sown. So suffering could come in that way. Or thirdly, God sometimes uses suffering to build godly character, to mould us and shape us. One of our best family holidays was we went out to the Hebridean Islands off the west coast of Scotland. We had a great time out there a few years ago. One of the things that we enjoyed doing as a family, and we've enjoyed for many years, is sort of rock pooling, trying to find crabs and things like that down by the beach. And out there, some of the rocks, some amazing beaches, and some of the rocks were so smoothed off and slippery and just amazingly smooth rocks. All the sharp edges knocked off them. But the process of smoothing off those rocks involved Atlantic storms bashing into them for centuries. Stones being hurled up and landed on the rocks by the shore, knocking off all the rough edges, smoothing them off, wearing them down. But now there are these sort of beautiful rock formations and smoothed off kind of lovely rocks. God sometimes uses suffering to build godly character in us, to mould us and shape us, to knock off rough edges. And look at what Paul says in verse 7. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited or proud, you might say, I was given a thorn in my flesh. So in order to stop him becoming proud, God has allowed him to have something, this thorn in his flesh. Or I believe literally, what's translated there, a thorn in the flesh. You know, we think of like a little thistle thorn or something. I think it could carry the meaning, a stake that keeps me pinned down. It's like a fence post. A stake that keeps me pinned down. A thorn in the flesh. What was it? Well, this has set some hairs running. This has set some speculation going. What is this thing he's talking about? Is it literally a thorn? Not many people seem to think that. Some people think it was maybe he had very poor eyesight and it was constantly frustrating to him. He had seen a very bright light on the road to Damascus. Some people think it was he had a weak constitution. He got ill easily. He wasn't very robust. Some people think he was maybe very shy. It was very hard for him to do all this going around talking to everyone, telling them the gospel. Some people think maybe he had a stammer. He couldn't talk good. But basically we don't know. But that doesn't stop lots of theological students writing papers about it and people doing PhDs about it, you know, with some new idea. You know, Paul's thorn in the flesh was he just longed to be on roller skates and he couldn't roller skate. It's unlikely, isn't it? So unlikely as what he meant. We don't know what he meant basically, but whatever it was, he was tormented by it. Verse 7 says, tormented. He asked God 3 times to take it away. He was tormented by it as if it was something sent from Satan. That's how strongly he felt about it. Now, just as we've seen, and I've talked about, there's various reasons why we suffer. Just being human, we bring it on ourselves, that kind of thing. There's several responses to suffering. So Paul's suffering here. There's several ways people respond. Some people become bitter and blame God and shake their fist at heaven. We maybe know people like that. You end up robbed of all joy. It sucks all the joy out of life. Some people just give up. Suffering comes, they just give up. As one commentator puts it, some people fail to gain any blessing from the experience because they don't put any courage into the experience. They fail to gain any blessing from the experience because they don't put any courage into the experience. They just give up. Or some people grit their teeth and press on. They put on a brave front, but that can be draining to keep it up. It can result in a sudden collapse when we can't do it any longer. Well, there's some responses to suffering, but there's a fourth way, and that's my third thing that I want us to see. So the third thing is how God helped Paul. So we've seen in verse 8 that 3 times he asked God to take it away, but God does not take it away. What is the answer? Well, verse 9, God's response to him, he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you." My grace is sufficient. Now, we often hear at Carlisle Baptist Church think about grace as being when God treats us in a way we don't deserve. But there's another little way of remembering or thinking about grace, and that's to take the 5 letters of grace. You may well have heard this before, but one way of thinking about grace is God's riches available at Christ's expense. God's riches available at Christ's expense. I know there's 2 A's in it. But God's riches available at Christ's expense. So we have access to all the richness of God, all the riches that God wants for us, but it's come at a great cost to Christ. That's one way of thinking about grace. Now, we often think about saving grace. That is, when God treats us as we don't deserve by sending Jesus to die on a cross. Not because we deserve to be forgiven, but as a free gift to those who will just simply turn to him in repentance and faith. So we think about that saving grace. But the Bible also talks about grace in other ways. It talks about a sufficiency of grace. That's been on Paul's mind earlier in 2 Corinthians. Just back in 2 Corinthians 9, so that's just over the page. 9 verse 8, he said, which is column, page 1264, the second column. It says, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work." So God can provide in a way that's totally sufficient for whatever we face. He will bless us abundantly in all things at all times, having all you need. I mean, that is sufficient, isn't it? God's grace is sufficient to save us, but it's also sufficient to keep us. But also, so we can think of saving grace, we can think of the sufficiency of grace, but also the strengthening that grace can bring. Look again at chapter 12, verse 9. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So there's a power in it. It's sufficient, but it can strengthen. So Paul says, so I can boast. What can he boast about? I can boast about my weakness, he says. We've actually seen that. If you've been here previous weeks, he's been talking about how things have gone wrong and how things have been hard. I can boast about my weakness because God's power is made perfect in weakness. It's like Paul is saying, less of me means more of Christ. So I actually delight in it, he says in verse 10. Grace from God means that when I'm weak, I'm actually strong. which must mean that when I feel at my strongest, I feel self-reliant, and I don't need God so much, and I keep him at arm's length, then actually I'm at my weakest at that point. I've been reading a book about Vladimir Putin. It's called Putin's Wars. It's all about his time as leader of Russia. And one of the very interesting things in there is that Putin has spent his whole time strengthening his position as leader in Russia, making sure he can't be challenged. He seems to have got rid of anyone that might oppose him or stand up to him. He's gradually been surrounded by people that he doesn't feel threatened by, and who seem to often not be able to tell him what he doesn't want to hear. He no doubt has felt like he was in a stronger and stronger position as he got rid of rivals. But it turns out that he really seems to have been in a weaker and weaker position, as people have just dared not tell him what he didn't want to hear, and have just told him what he did want to hear, and not necessarily told him the full story or the truth. He's felt like he was getting stronger and stronger, and actually he's been getting weaker and weaker. Or that's what it seems to be, or the writer of my book I've been reading is portraying it that way anyway. But I think that can so often be us as well, can't it? The more self-sufficient we feel, the more we feel we don't need God. So if I feel I'm doing very well financially, or I stored up a big pension pot, I might feel, well, I'm sorted then, aren't I? Or if I feel like I've got lots of friends and family around me, lots of sort of big support network, we might say, well, I don't need God so much. If I've got great health, things are going well, I don't need God so much. But take away some of those things, and we might be on our knees a bit more praying. We might feel maybe we do need God a bit more. Well, my time is gone, but just very quickly, some takeaways for us. There's a guy called P.T. Forsyth. I've got a picture of him. Here he is. He died about 100 years ago. He was a Scottish theologian. I don't always put a picture next to my quotes, but I thought he's such a handsome guy. I'll just put him up with some eye candy for the girls. Just look at that man. What a man. Anyway, he said this. He said it is a greater thing to pray for pain's conversion, for it to be converted, than for its removal. It's a greater thing to pray for pain's conversion than its removal. What do you mean? He meant that pain can actually be converted into something positive. So we just don't want any pain, do we? I don't want to remove it. I want this hardship, this suffering, this thing taken away. But it might be that we'll miss out on something good if we do that. He's so distracting, Derek, to the girls. I think we should get him off the screen. So here's some ways it can be converted into a positive, or some ways of thinking about suffering and pain and hardship. One of the things I think we learn from this section, 2 Corinthians 12, is spiritual health is more important than physical health. So we don't quite know what this thorn in the flesh was. Could have been a physical thing, but God was more interested in Paul's spiritual health and keeping him humble and developing in him Christian character. That's actually a more important thing than physical health. So if we have physical health struggles, we of course don't want that, do we? But God might be using that to develop in us some Christian character which is more important than our physical healing. 3 times Paul asked for this thing to be taken away, wherever it was. But God didn't take it away. Secondly, God knows how to balance burdens and blessings. We saw at the start, Paul had these amazing experiences and blessings from God, but God had balanced them out. He kept Paul humble. Now you might think, well, that seems a beastly thing. I think it was a kindness. It was a kindness. Third thing, not all sickness or suffering is because you sinned. There might be other reasons why sickness or suffering has come your way. Jesus also himself talked about that. We haven't got time to turn there, but he also talks about that. Hardship is not necessarily because you're more sinful than someone else. Although sometimes because of sin, hardship comes our way. Fourthly, don't allow hardship to put a wedge between you and God. Now, I brought along this, which, if there's any problems with discipline, next door in Sunday Club. No, it's not that. But it's a special, you might call it an axe. I think it's actually officially called an awl. And it's the difference between this and an axe is it's got this very fat bit on the end. It's almost like a sledgehammer on one end. Let me tell you about this log that I once had that we sometimes chop up logs at our house to burn. And this log once came. It was a big chunk of a tree. It filled a full wheelbarrow. I couldn't carry it. It was massive. And but going right through this section of a tree that was like that thick and like so big I couldn't hug it. Going right through the middle of it was a branch that had been growing in the past, or even a couple of branches, and the tree sort of grown surrounding them. And it meant that when you tried to chop it, it wouldn't break up. So that's where an awl comes in, because what you do is you get it in as far as you can, you get a massive whack into the tree. And then this bit you can whack with a big hammer. So this is stuck into the log, big section of a tree. And then with my sledgehammer, I'm whacking this and driving the wedge in. But this thing was so tough, all I could do is break little bits off the edge and get it smaller and smaller and try and get it down to a size that I could deal with. Why am I telling you about that? Sometimes when the hard thing comes, the suffering comes, it's like a wedge being driven into us, isn't it? And we can allow that suffering, that hardship, to break us away from God. Or we can choose to be the other side and allow it to press us into God. So as I was breaking bits off the side of the log, the other side of this thing, it's been pushed more into it. So when suffering comes, we don't want to let it drive us from God, break us away from Him, separate us off from Him. We want it to drive us towards Him. Drive us into prayer, drive us into seeking Him in a new way, asking for His help, asking for His Spirit to help us. Now, I don't know what hardships you're facing. I know some things that are going on in some people's lives, but I don't know the hardships you're facing. But what I do know is the world out there, it talks a lot about resilience, and there's a lot of concern about people being snowflakes these days and can't cope with anything hard. And the world tries to talk about resilience. But I don't think the world has a compelling answer like the New Testament. It doesn't know about the gospel of grace.